I'm going to read just the opening of the book, a page and a half or so, just to give you a little taste of things, and then we can talk. Zorrie Underwood had been known throughout the county as a hard worker for more than 50 years. So it troubled her when finally the hoe started slipping from her hands, the paring knife from her fingers, the breath in shallow bursts from her lungs, and smack dab in the middle of the day, she had to lie down. At first, she carried out this previously unthinkable obligation on the worn leather of the daybed in the front room, with her jaw set, hands pressed tight against her sides, staring up at the end of a long crack that ran the length of the ceiling, or at the flecks of blue light thrown onto the legs of the dining room table by the stained glass J that hung in the south window. When after several minutes of this, she felt her breath slowing and the blood flowing back out through her veins, she would ease herself up, shake her head, and resume whatever activity had been interrupted. Once, though, after she had slipped in the garden and landed in a tangle of rhubarb, she lay down on the daybed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that wasn't interrupted until late in the evening the cat began mewling and scratching at the side door. It took her a long time to come fully into consciousness, and as she lay there, vaguely urging her eyelids to open, aware that she was not quite awake, it seemed to her she had never felt so comfortable, so careless, so at ease. She set a feather pillow on the daybed and pulled a light wool blanket out of the upstairs closet. She began to intersperse her work in the garden and yard with regularly scheduled naps. She would lie on her side with her back to the room and look at the deep white of the wall. She would be unaware that her eyes had closed. She would sleep. Every now and again, her conscience would chase her up off the daybed and back into her weedy rows or fruit-filled trees, but mostly during the time she had allotted, and sometimes past it, she just gazed at the wall or slept. One morning, well before it was time to lie down, she looked over at the pillow and blanket and soft leather and realized with a shudder that seemed to chill and warm her both that she was filled with longing. She had never liked to dream. After diphtheria took first her mother and then her father, she was raised by an elderly aunt who told her that people were born dreaming of devils and dark roses and should beware. This aunt, whom her dying father had only called on reluctantly, for she had drunk too deeply from the cup of bitterness after a badly failed marriage, shook and scolded Zorrie vigorously when, as happened frequently during the first months, she woke up crying. If she woke up screaming, she received a slap. Sometimes she received a slap anyway. Either because of what she was leaving behind in the dizzying hallways of her head or what she was waking to, Zorrie came to harbor what proved a lifelong distrust of the deep hours, as her aunt referred to them, when the mind played tricks on itself. Days were different. Zorrie ran, she skipped, she won a prize at school for turning the best cartwheel. She and the other children played with hoops and balls in the yard. No one could climb a tree as quickly as she could, and there were only 2 boys in the school who could beat her at arm wrestling. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for reading it. It's always great to just hear it in your own voice. So in Zorrie, for those of you who don't know the plot line, we follow a woman's life in rural Indiana from the Great Depression until the end of her life, as she encounters a great deal of loss, early loss, which Laird read a bit from, as well as affection and this bitter aunt. She becomes a ghost girl at the radium dial company, and I won't tell you all the other things that happen, but it's fascinating. But I think it's a book that honors and considers the life of a person who lived pretty humbly on the sidelines of a larger drama, as we all do. And in an interview with Smoke Lawn Quarterly, you described the novel, I think it was still in process at this point, I don't know that you had finished it, but as encompassing about as much love and loss as a mortal can bear. And that felt so true to my reading experience. Her griefs are common griefs, but no less burdening because of them. And I was reading, I read the book and I was like, and then I was researching and going back, and I realized that these characters, some of them have appeared, right? 17 years earlier, we saw there's just a brief mention of a Zorrie Underwood from Indiana, in which we're set in farm country, and Opal and Noah are sort of the primary characters. So my question is, has Zorrie is she part of this conversation from that first book? And has she been with you for 17 years? And what was that process of writing this book and living in that same sort of landscape like?
Yeah. So yeah, Zorrie's been with me for a while, and it's true that she sort of bloomed out of that earlier book. She has a small but important role in it. She's referred often to as the woman next door, or the woman on the farm next door, and that book does indeed center characters who are now not the primary focus in this book, although quite important. Um, and so she grew out of that. I was just so intrigued by her, but it wasn't out of nowhere. As I realized, it took me a while to put this together, but not too terribly long ago, I discovered rediscovered a manuscript of my first. Actually, it was my first published story, and I brought it with me tonight. I am still sort of stunned by it. It's a story that's called Old Woman. And you probably can't see it very well out there, but it says 1990 on the top with my name, and it was meant to be a submission. I didn't send it to the place I thought I would, so I have this copy. But this old woman who's peeling potatoes for her dinner, who's paying careful attention to her work, who's waiting for her family to return. This is Zorrie, effectively. And so this story was written, right, some 30 years ago. And so that character has been in my mind. And she wasn't quite ready when I was writing that earlier novel, Indiana, to bloom fully. But she was there, and my mind wanted to spend a little bit more time in rural Indiana. And so I wrote the first draft of what would subsequently become Zorrie 17 years later. And it was kind of a long journey with this character, but she's always been real pleasant company, as my Indiana grandmother might have said.
Well, I mean, that's another thing, like the vernacular, I feel like you really nail it. So I'm coming to you from the borderlands of Ohio and Indiana, and yet it also feels like very much of a different time period. Like there's something a little bit estranged from it, but also very a part of the Midwestern language. You grew up in Indiana, central Indiana, right? And you moved there as a child. And I'm wondering, when you were, is that landscape is a place that you have spent, this is your 8th novel, so and not all of the books are set there, but you've spent a great deal of time in that place. And I love that you're doing that. And I wonder, like, how much do you know about the hold that the landscape has on you, or the place has?
I feel like I'm starting to understand that it has a hold on me, in ways that I articulate more and more frequently. I return fairly often to that landscape. I spent about 6 years, so on my grandmother's farm in central Indiana, about 40 miles north of Indianapolis. It's flat country, sort of gentle rises, that kind of thing. But it's pretty flat, and a lot of corn, a lot of beans around there, and it's right, unremarkable, and mocked from the coasts and so on and so forth. But really rich and full of layers of history that by no means commence with white settlers coming in the middle of the 19th century, right? It's deep history. It's native land, and full of power and meaningfulness, it seems to me. And you sort of imagine you get farther and farther away from your those experiences in junior high and high school and so forth. And I went to Indiana University, so it was my base for another 3 or 4 years. You imagine maybe you'll think about other things, but in fact, it continues to pull me. It continues to hold me, and I was there this summer with my 15-year-old. We did a pandemic road trip and spent time, and it was great to be back.
I was recently reading a Boston Globe interview that you did, and you were talking about how a simple heart is borrowing how the novel is utilizing the kind of structure of A Simple Heart by Flaubert, in which we follow one person's life. But it opens or foregrounds with this silver age of existence. That's a quote from you, because that's such a beautiful way of describing it. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what you think that foregrounding, this silver age of existence in the opening, does for one's novel, which it does so many wonderful things, but you just speak so brilliantly. I'd love to hear you talk about what you think about it.
Well, yeah, so the Flaubert was really important to finding a way to tell the story of this life. So maybe I should say that first. When I was thinking about, trying to figure out who Zorrie Underwood was, and with the first stabs at writing a book, was 17 or 18 now years ago. And I had always loved the structure of this short work by Gustave Flaubert, one of his last works, actually. I think it has 6 parts, and it begins at the end of the character's life, and then goes all the way back to the beginning and marches forward, catches where it started, and then goes a little bit farther, and then it's done. It's some sort of elegant and a way to encompass a life, but to foreground the fact that it's been a life that's been well-lived and long-lived. And there's no secrets about that, right? The hero isn't going to die halfway through, unless we're getting really postmodern about it. But you know from the start that the character reaches their silver years. And that seems really useful to me, to the extent that I saw, you saw that I held up that first short story. It was called Old Woman, and the character is referred to as Old Woman all the way through this short story from 30 years ago. And the first 15 years of Zorrie's existence, it was called Old Woman, and Zorrie was referred to as Old Woman. And when I was in conversations with my fabulous editor at your publishing house as well, Bloomsbury, there was even a little bit of talk of, well, that could be interesting to keep that maybe even just as a title. Ultimately, I'm really glad that we went with Zorrie. I think that gesture had outlived itself. It was really useful to me to get this sense of a kind of, I don't know, sort of density to the character, right? This is someone who's lived, and she's survived, and she's looking back in a way. We're looking over her shoulder as she's gazing back at this long life to a certain degree. And I realized that the novel, the language had embedded enough of that I didn't need that scaffolding anymore of constantly reminding the reader that this was Old Woman. It's Zorrie. And Zorrie's, it's a kind of it's a name I've always liked, and I was sort of proud to assume it on her behalf.
It's a great name. Is there any sort of family connection for that name, or it's just,
My mother was asking me the other day about the last name Underwood, because it turns out that one of her best friends from that period when we were traveling abroad, her pre-married name was Underwood, and I must have internalized that. And then Zorrie, I'm pretty sure I got it off a gravestone in Clinton County. I'd have to look at my notes, but I go out and walk old graveyards all the time. New England is great for that, I have to say, but rural Indiana isn't bad either. So I'm pretty sure I pulled it off a gravestone.
So part of the storyline is this period of time where she is painting. She's one of the ghost girls, or the women painting on the clocks with radium, and it's just such a haunting imagery. And I guess I have 2 questions about that, so answer whichever one you want. The first one is, I think it's a really smart decision and an interesting one, that you could very easily have written the book that's exploring the women who existed in that factory for their lives and experienced the fallout of that, the cancers and such. But she becomes, it's a kind of quick foray for her, and so she has these friendships that she keeps in contact and stays with. So I'm curious about that, and then also just the kinds of research that you did within that aspect. You always seem to have fully digested whatever that research is, and it doesn't come out let me tell you this detail. And I'd love to hear you talk about that too.
Yeah, well, I could pay you the same compliment, Tarashea. You're really good at metabolizing the research in your books. which is one of the great pleasures of reading your work. Yeah, you know, in the Radium Girl stuff, I read an article in the New York Times in the 90s about the Radium Girls. And I clipped it, and I was having a brief but very important to me correspondence with the late German writer W.G. Sebald. I clipped the article, wrote up an overlong young man's letter, and sent it off to him because I thought it might be something that could be useful, right? My presumptuousness. And he wrote back a very nice note. He always wrote short, nice notes back. That was the correspondence. But just to say that, so in the 90s, that's when it came onto my radar screen. And I just sort of tucked the idea away. I made a photocopy of the article, I should say, and kept that, and I still have it. And so that, you know, this was one of those sort of horrifying episodes, right, of corporate malfeasance, young women who were drawn to this work, who were good at doing the close work of painting dials on clocks and even watches with luminous paint, who were instructed that the substance they were painting with was, of course, perfectly safe, radium. And, you know, it was already killing people left and right. But, you know, these young women there was one big plant in Ottawa, Illinois, where this was done. There was another in Orange, New Jersey. There's a fabulous book by Kate Moore called Radium Girls, where you can read more about it. There's a great documentary on YouTube by Carol Langer, where you can learn more about it, which actually has live interviews with some of the people who survived this. But it's you know, fascinating and sort of frightening history. The young women were gaslighted. There's nothing wrong with you. This isn't our problem. Your teeth are falling out, and that sort of thing. So it was really compelling, and the fact that it was done to the vulnerable, power being exercised in this way, really abhorrent way. So there was that about it, right? It's this, one of those things, one of the uglier, darker sides of American history, and we see versions of it all the way through Erin Brockovich and so on. It's the same old story. It goes back to the matchstick girls of the 19th century and earlier, of course. Anyway, so there was that, and then there was just some of the stories from doing research in Kate Moore's book, and Claudia Clark has a wonderful book about it, and thinking about who were these individuals, and that got me very interested. I took a research trip to Ottawa and brought a Geiger counter because I had heard that you could make it crackle if you brought it close enough to the graves, and indeed you don't have to get very close at all.
No.
Yeah, they're still crackling. They're still hot. These poor women, some of them who died in their 20s from nothing to do with their day jobs, and I visited the site of, it was a former high school, the first radium luminous dial painting company. That's all still there. And there's one little monument that an 8th grade girl who had heard about this history said, she raised the money, we have to do something. It's this poignant monument. Poignant that they would point their brushes in their mouths, dip it in radium paint, point in their mouths. Anyway, so all of that to say that it was really rich history. And I had this story about Zorrie Underwood, who was living on a farm 3 hours away. Something wasn't quite right. Something was missing. There were a couple of things that weren't right about the manuscript. And having done this research, I was thinking about it maybe for another project. I thought, well, what if Zorrie got a job there? Because that they wanted young women who had nimble fingers, and she fit the bill. She made her way there. She got this job, and it seemed to me just what that early part of the book needed, because it has this, in her mind, this, when she's doing it, it's beautiful. It's sort of this extraordinary magical substance, and she learns over the course of her long life just how devastating it was. So there's this kind of mix of beauty and then something that is quite sad. And then the last thing, little show and tell, I keep by my writing desk. I'm just sorry, I'm leaning forward. This postcard that I don't know if you can see very well, but you'll get the idea. It is a decommissioned card catalog card from the San Francisco Public Library that Ann Hamilton and a collaborator farmed out to people to decorate, right? They were getting rid of the card catalog, and they thought that they would give them out to as many people as possible. And they did extraordinary, drawings and so forth on them. And this is the card for Yasunari Kawabata's Beauty and Sadness. And I had this card since before I wrote the precursor novel, Indiana, Indiana. But in my mind, something that's beautiful, but also tinged with sadness. And which one has the upper hand, beauty or sadness? That's maybe for a reader to decide, but I think both are there. And I think that that's important to Zorrie and to this world that I was trying to work with.